Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Rethinking Booker T and W.E.B, an online professional development seminar sponsored by the Florida Virtual School and America in Class from the National Humanities Center. I'm Richard Schramm, Vice President for Education Programs, and I'll be moderating the session this morning. I want to welcome all of our friends from the Florida Virtual School back with us. I just want to remind you, you folks are very familiar with our format here. I just want to remind you again that if you go to americainclass.org, you'll find this website, and from this website you'll be able to get access to all of the resources that the National Humanities Center offers for teachers. I'd also like to remind you again that the PowerPoint for this presentation plus a recording is available at the Rethinking Booker T and W.E.B website, the website from which you obtained your reading. So if you want to relive the experience, you can go there and do that. Also, again, let me remind you, feel free to plunder the PowerPoint. It's there for you, and you can use it in your classes, so please do so. Again, let me remind you that we'll be sending you documentation of participation once we receive your seminar evaluation, and you can get to that evaluation once again by going to the Rethinking Booker T and W.E.B website. As you know, you find the link there for the evaluation. You can fill that out and send it in to us, and then we will send you your documentation of participation. We can move right along since you folks are quite familiar with the way we do things, and let me state our goals for this morning. We hope to deepen your understanding of the relationship between the thought of Booker T. Washington and W.E.B.DuBois. We would like to help you take their rivalry beyond the issue of manual training versus the liberal arts. That's usually the way these two men are taught. We also would like to offer some advice on how to teach the Washington-Du rivalry. Now, those goals chart well, or excuse me, rather, we have a few framing questions here that we hope will structure the discussion this morning. On what issues did Washington and Du Bois disagree? Why did they disagree? How extensive were their disagreements? And to what extent were their disagreements due to philosophical, political, or tactical considerations? Now, those framing questions chart very well with what you folks asked in the forum. In fact, one of the questions was, on what issues did Washington and Du Bois disagree? So you can see the overlap is quite exact. How did the black public react to their different approaches to African American advancement? How did the white public react? How were their views received in the North and in the South? What was the international reaction? What was the relationship between Washington and Marcus Garvey? Now, that is a question that we really don't address in the seminar, so I'm going to ask our scholar at the very outset to take a minute just to address that question to make sure that we respond to it. How did the support of Northern philanthropists influence Washington's views and the educational approach of the Tuskegee Institute? And is the Martin Luther King-Malcolm X rivalry a replay of the Washington-Du Bois rivalry? Some excellent questions there. To lead us through those questions, we are very pleased to have with us today Kenneth Jenkin, Professor of African and Afro-American Studies at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Kenneth was a Fellow of the National Humanities Center in 2000-2001, where he worked on White, the biography of Walter White, Mr. NAACP, book which received honorable mention in the Outstanding Book Awards from the Gustavus Meyer Center for the Study of Bigotry and Human Rights in North America. In 1993, Kenneth published Rayford W. Logan and the Dilemma of the African American Intellectual. So now let me turn the proceedings over to Kenneth as soon as I can locate his name right here on our list. Okay, Kenneth, you are now in charge of the seminar, and I would like to pose that question about Washington and Marcus Garvey to you. If you could take a minute to respond to that, then we can dive into the real matter of our discussion this morning.
Sure. Good morning, everybody. Marcus Garvey was a Jamaican, and he founded the Universal Negro Improvement Association, which at the time, which would be in the early 20th century, was probably the largest organization of black people in the world. One of the markers of the UNIA was an insistence on African American independence, and in particular African American economic development. Marcus Garvey early on showed a preference for Booker T. Washington's philosophies of economic development and economic independence, and came to the United States in 1915 initially with the idea of meeting Washington and getting his support for establishing an institution like the Tuskegee Institute in his home country of Jamaica. Unfortunately, by the time he was able to get to the United States, Booker T. Washington had died, and they never met. I think that there is a fair amount of overlap between the two figures related to economic development and the importance of African American economic independence from whites. Let me also say that today is February 21st, which is also the anniversary of the assassination of Malcolm X. And I noticed that one of the questions was there about the relationship between King and Malcolm X and how that relates to the dispute that we're going to be talking about today. I just thought it's an auspicious day to have this webinar.
Yes, good. I would just like to point out that our participants can find a really good essay on Marcus Garvey in the UNIA and our Divining America website. So if you want to go there, you can find it. It's really helpful. Okay, Kenneth, so shall we dive into Booker T and W.E.B.?
Yes, let's do that. So here is. It was kind of clear to me that from your comments as you were signing on to the webinar over the past week or so that not all of you were terribly familiar with Booker T. Washington and W.E.B.DuBois, and so Richard had developed a couple of slides just to give some basic biographical information. Washington. The two men were really different in many ways. Booker T. Washington was born in slavery, and as you can see here, he performed a variety of manual jobs, and he made his way to the Hampton Institute, where he graduated from there and transferred the ideas of industrial education and I guess educational discipline. He transferred that to the Tuskegee Institute, which he founded in 1881. And used the Tuskegee Institute as a base of operations. It's called here the Tuskegee machine. I think that is, would call to mind a political machine, and I think that is an apt comparison because he ran not only the Tuskegee Institute, but he had influence over a wide variety of African American weekly newspapers. Some of them he owned behind the scenes. Some of them he directed the editorials behind the scenes. He had control over patronage, who could get appointed, which African Americans could get appointed to federal office. So he really had a machine there. W.E.B.DuBois, as you can see here, was born in freedom. He came from humble background. A lot of people think that he came from an elite background, but in fact that's not the case. He was raised by his mother, who was a domestic servant until she was disabled and could no longer work. But he was born in Western Massachusetts. His curiosity and intelligence caught the attention of the school principal, who helped him to get to Fisk University in Nashville. From there, he went on to Harvard and was the first African American PhD from there. He taught at a variety of institutions, but most importantly, and for the longest length of time, Atlanta University, which of course is in Atlanta. He, for a variety of reasons that we'll examine later on today, he became an opponent of Booker T. Washington. And one of the results of that was he founded the Niagara Movement, which we'll talk about later on today as well, and was a co-founder of the NAACP. So more on yeah, there we go. So I hope that gives some little background that can help you place these two thinkers in some historical context. I would like to start with I guess Booker T. Washington's I guess his seminal piece of work, which was the Atlanta Compromise. This was a talk that catapulted him into national attention. It came at a time when Frederick Douglass had died, so the major leader of Black America had passed, and people, black and white, were looking around for casting about for a new leader, and this was this Washington speech was the one that did the trick. It proposed a framework of adjusting race relations in the United States, in which he said that African Americans would withdraw from political life. African Americans would not participate in politics. They would not fight for their rights through the courts, and they would otherwise give in to segregation. And in exchange, according to the Atlanta Compromise, whites would help African Americans prosper materially, and would prevent groups like the Klan, the Ku Klux Klan, and others from attacking them. This was his program for racial uplift, which he incorporated into Up From Slavery. So we'll be referring to documents here. Sometimes it'll say the Atlanta Compromise, other times it'll say Up From Slavery. They all kind of come around the same time and come from the same source, which is his memoir, Up From Slavery. We'll also be spending a fair amount of time looking at what Du Bois had to say about Washington from Mr. Booker T. Washington and others. This was originally appeared as a review. I forget exactly where it appeared. I think the North American Review, it sounds about right. It originally appeared as an essay, as a review essay of From Slavery. And when Du Bois was asked to compile his essays and develop a book with the Souls of Black Folk, which was published in 1903, this became a prominent essay in that. It was Du Bois had started out, I guess, as a moderate supporter of Washington, and soon had realized that that Washington's program was not the way to go. And so, in this essay of Mr. Booker T. Washington and others, this is, I guess, the opening shot in the polemic that Du Bois started with Washington, going over and taking issue with him over his program of economic advancement, as well as his renouncing political participation in the right to vote. I wanted to focus today's webinar on 6 areas of disagreement, as you see here, and we'll go through these in order. They disagreed on emancipation and reconstruction. They disagreed on education. They disagreed on capitalism, how it operated and what its nature was. They disagreed on the issue of political rights, on relationships with whites, and they had a different approach toward political leadership.
So this is going to take us well beyond the manual labor, liberal arts education dispute that seems to be the focus around which most of these Booker T and W.E.B. are taught.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay.
So shall we start with the first one?
Let's dive in.
Oh, I'm sorry. Here. So here are some suggestions on how to teach this disagreement. I think it makes sense. I mean, I was just using these slides in my class this past week, and I thought that they were helpful. Thank you, Richard. I thought they were helpful for guiding a discussion, because you want to avoid, I think, superficial dichotomies. I don't think you want to take a position either supporting Washington or Du Bois, or criticizing each one and taking sides. I think that seems to kind of limit discussion. I think you should avoid that wrestling match. The cliches that come to mind. Washington was for manual training. Du Bois wanted everybody to go to college. Things like that. Those are cliches that I think once you get locked into them, it's hard to advance a discussion any further. And then you'll find students will say, "Oh, I think everybody should go to college," or somebody else will say, "I think everybody should walk. People have to crawl before they can walk," things like that. So I think it's useful to avoid those dichotomies, at least for the time being. and then let the students come to their own decisions. And then on the other side of it, I think there's a tendency in teaching African American history that there's a tendency to say, well, everybody had the same goal. King and Malcolm X had the same goal. Du Bois and Washington had the same goal. So on, and so everybody had the same goal, but they just had different ways of going about it. And it would have been nice if they could have worked together. I think that doesn't advance things either. There were real differences, and those differences represented strategies on how to move forward. And some would work, and some wouldn't work. And I think it just kind of confuses things just to say, well, everybody was it's not all let's all hold hands and move together. I don't think it was like that. So now I think we can start. Yes, here we go. So I think the first area of disagreement was on emancipation and reconstruction. I think that this was a debate that was not academic. In other words, Reconstruction was in the recent past. It was in their memories. It was certainly in Booker T. Washington's memory. I think to some degree it was in Du Bois's, although he would have been very young. But among the majority of African Americans, they lived through Reconstruction, so they knew what was going on, and how they understood what happened in their immediate past would have a great impact on what they proposed to do for the future. I think Booker T. Washington frames the issue of Reconstruction very starkly. He says that African Americans made a mistake, that when Reconstruction began, African Americans immediately went to the top. They ran for office. They participated fully in political life, and they neglected to build a strong economic foundation. And from Booker T. Washington's point of view, that was a grave mistake. You had to start life at the bottom and not at the top. I think I would just pose these questions as you look over these excerpts from his Atlanta Compromise speech. I think it's helpful to not take them by themselves, but to merge your new understanding with your understanding of American history up to this point. And so I would just pose a couple of these questions here to you. Is it accurate to say that that what African Americans were trying to accomplish by participating in political life was unrelated to their economic advancement? And then I think it's helpful to pose to students the second question here: which of these two statements makes more sense to you?
Okay.
Yeah. So I'll.
Okay. Well, why don't we put these on the table? Why don't I just read these and get them out there for us for our discussion? This is from the Atlanta Compromise speech. Ignorant and inexperienced, it is not strange that in the first years of our new life we began at the top instead at the bottom. That a seat in Congress or the state legislature was more sought than real estate or industrial skill. That the political convention or stump speaking had more attraction than starting a dairy farm or a truck garden. Our greatest danger is that the great leap from slavery to freedom, we may overlook the fact that the masses of us are to live by the production of our hands. It is at the bottom of life we must begin and not at the top. So let's focus on that second one. Which makes more sense to you given your knowledge of Reconstruction and the period in which this speech was delivered? So let's see what some of our comments are here. I'm sure those who disagreed with Washington would say that they had been at the bottom for too long. I see two steps in the process. Having strong economical support, African Americans could move forward and participate in political life. Joy Linda, this is in response to a previous comment. That is one of my favorite quotes ever, talking about the glove and the separateness of the fingers quote. So we see here people do seem to think that you start with economic independence and move from there. Practical approach at the time, unfortunate, and wonder if the government shouldn't have done more. Somebody has to grab the golden ring. Booker T's idea of the ring of Maslow's hierarchy. There's a kind of a hierarchical organization of movement from bottom to the top. Okay, let's focus on that point for a moment, Kenneth, of context here about the times. Um, a practical approach for the time. Could you comment on that?
Well, I think in some ways it was, as we'll see as we move along. I think one way to look at it is that Washington was recognizing what in fact was occurring. So this speech came in 1895. 5 years before that, Mississippi rewrote its state constitution, which formally disfranchised African Americans. Other states followed, and I believe the process was completed probably in 1906 or 1908. So in some ways you can say what Booker T. Washington was proposing was just a recognition of the reality, which is that African Americans would have no place anyway. But at the same time, I wonder, are you able to, are you able to, how do you protect your economic gains if you don't have access to the political arena? I think, that if you can't affect local regulations and state laws by lobbying, let alone having a presence in the legislature or on your county council, county commissioner, city council. If you can't do that, it's extraordinarily difficult to advance, because you're at the whim of somebody else who doesn't have to take into account your desires.
Mm-hmm. So the context cuts two ways. There's an economic context, but to ensure whatever economic gains you need, you also need some political clout.
I think that's really kind of at the nub here,
Okay.
And I think that's how Du Bois answered it.
Okay, we have a good question here that relates to one of our forum questions. What do the newly freed slaves want at this time? In other words, how did African Americans in the South respond to Washington?
Oh, that's a good question. I think African Americans in the South responded to him quite positively. He was holding out the promise of some type of education. He was as part of his Tuskegee machine. Machine is often used as a negative way, in a negative term, but part of it he had, I guess, what would be equivalent to what do you call it? An extension program. So he brought good practices for agriculture and public health and business out to areas beyond the Tuskegee Institute. He held a promise because he had contacts, extensive contacts with white America. Philanthropies like philanthropists like Andrew Carnegie or Julius Rosenwald and others. He was looked at really quite favorably. Mm-hmm. So I think he was favorably received.
So you mentioned the white philanthropists in the North. How was he received among white Southerners?
White Southerners, I think there was quite a lot of them who liked him. Because he was proposing something that that they wanted to hear, which was, how to keep African Americans, keep them not too educated, give them enough education, but not too much, and encouraging them to stay in the South and continue to work. He provided a stable labor force and promised a politically pacified labor force.
Mm-hmm. I think one of our participants makes a really good point here. Often when you're talking about Washington, people overlook the fact that I think he was taking the long view. Wasn't he looking over time? Our participant writes, Washington's position allows for a multitude of powerful areas to be developed: relations, time, change of heart of white Americans, self-built respect. Is that not true? Was this a kind of a long-term process for not only building economic power, but also eventually political power based on change of heart of white America?
Well, I would say Du Bois didn't think so. And I would say that many other people didn't think so. That was a very contentious point. Washington, I think, thought so.
Right.
But I mean, that really kind of gets to the heart of the disagreement here.
Right.
And I don't think so, but I'm trying not to inject my point of view in like that.
Nice. Okay. Well, shall we move on to the next slide?
Yes, let's do that. So here is what Du Bois says in response to Washington's assertion that Reconstruction was a mistake. Perhaps I'll just read this. After the war and emancipation, the great form of Frederick Douglass, the greatest of American Negro leaders, still led the host. Self-assertion, especially in the political lines, was the main program. And behind Douglass came Eliot, Bruce, and Langston, and the Reconstruction politicians, and less conspicuous but of greater social significance, Alexander Crummell and Bishop Daniel Payne. These last two were important nationalists who also believed in economic development but did not want to surrender political rights. Then came the Revolution of 1876. The suppression of the Negro votes, the changing and shifting of ideals, and the seeking of new lights in the great night. Douglass, in his old age, still bravely stood for the ideals of his early manhood, ultimate assimilation through self-assertion and on no other terms. So I'm getting ahead of myself here. So this is Du Bois's critique here, that you cannot give up political self-assertion. If you do, you're giving up what you had fought for through the abolitionist movement and through Reconstruction.
Now that's an interesting comment about Douglass. Ultimate assimilation through self-assertion and on no other terms. Refresh our memory. Was Douglass later in his life was that self-assertion he was talking about political self-assertion, or was it more an act of individual will?
I would say he was talking about individual will. I mean, for Douglass, I mean, it's kind of an interesting use of Frederick Douglass here. You know, Frederick Douglass was, as we know, was an important abolitionist. But once the Civil War was over, his point of view was that what did he say? He said, "Free the slaves and leave them alone." He was not somebody who believed overly much in racial solidarity and race-based organization. He was an assimilationist. He did believe that African Americans should assume an equal position in American society. I think Du Bois's use of this is interesting because I mean Douglass was a strong advocate for political equality and agitation through the political system.
Mm-hmm. So would it be fair to say that when Douglass passed from the scene, there was sort of a vacuum? African Americans were left with no program. I mean, the self-assertion in the face of slavery, that was Douglass's great strength. But then once freedom was achieved, where do you go from there? And perhaps the solutions that Douglass's example in the slavery times was no longer appropriate for post-emancipation African Americans. Is that fair to say?
I think it's fair to say that a lot of people believe that. So, for example, Booker T. Washington believed that the agitation that Douglass was engaged in and his insistence on a moral critique of American society would not work. That white Americans were not open to that. That you needed another way. You needed to build up your economic power. Alexander Crummell was of a similar mind. That whites just weren't going to listen to any sort of critique, and that you had to get to work. That African Americans rather had to get to work and build up important institutions, whether it was political institutions, economic institutions, institutions related to public health, the church, things like that. That all effort needed to be put to finding a new way. That Douglass's approach just wouldn't work in this new climate.
Right. So it would be fair to say then that once the great job of emancipation was done, at this period now, after the Civil War from 1870s and on up through, well, right to the 20th century, the next great step was how then, where do we go from here? How then do African Americans work their way into the mainstream of American society. And that really, so the Washington-Du Bois debate comes at this critical time where there's sort of a vacuum. People are looking for, what do we do next? Is that fair to say?
That's fair to say. Yes.
Okay, okay. Good, good. Well, shall we move on then?
Yes, let's. They had a disagreement on education. So they disagreed about the history of Reconstruction. They also disagreed on education. I think these are four salient points that are worth keeping in mind. The industrial education, college education dichotomy. There's truth to it, but it's simplistic. It doesn't explain more than it explains. And you know, it's clear that Washington recognized the need for college-educated teachers, and in fact, that's who he hired for the Tuskegee faculty. And that was something that Du Bois had said in criticizing Washington. You know, Du Bois had said, you know, to Washington, look, you say that the college education is not all it's cracked up to be, but without us, you wouldn't have Tuskegee. On the other hand, Du Bois recognized that the majority of African Americans would not go to college, and he called for a universal common education. I guess that's grade school education. And beyond that, industrial education and industrial training for the majority of African Americans. But beyond these two types of education, industrial education or liberal arts education, the differences really kind of revolved around what was the purpose of education and what was the purpose of work. And I think as we look at these next series of slides, we'll see that even on, say, the issue of manual training, there's a disagreement between the two men, even though they both agreed that it was important and necessary for the majority of African Americans to have industrial training. They disagreed on the purpose of that training and what should be the heart of that manual training. So here's Booker T. Washington talking about the type of education that he thought was appropriate.
Shall I read that one?
Yes,
okay,
please.
Go ahead. Go, Kenneth, go.
Okay. One of the things I felt more strongly convinced than ever after spending this month and seeing the actual life of the colored people, and that was that in order to lift them up, something must be done more than merely to imitate New England education as it then existed. I saw more clearly than ever the wisdom of the system which General Armstrong had inaugurated at Hampton, and that is referring to industrial education with an emphasis on discipline. They were all going to learn the right thing as soon as it was shown them what was right. I was determined to start them off on a solid and thorough foundation, so far as their books were concerned. While they could locate the desert of the Sahara or the capital of China on an artificial globe, I found that the girls could not locate the proper places for the knives and forks on an actual dinner table, or the places on which the bread and meat should be set. And further on the issue of education. We shall prosper in proportion as we learn to dignify and glorify common labor and put brains and skill into the common occupations of life. Shall prosper in proportion as we learn to draw the line between the superficial and the substantial, the ornamental gewgaws of life and the useful. No race can prosper till it learns that there is as much dignity in tilling a field as in writing a poem.
Okay. Shall we pose the discussion questions we have there?
Please.
Okay. Well, how would you respond to those, folks? What were, in Washington's view, what were the appropriate subjects to teach in schools for African Americans, and what was the payoff of industrial education? Think about how you might pose those to your students. You can respond, but how might your students respond to that? We hope you'll use this material in your classes. Agricultural, okay. Knowledge should be relevant and related to real life. Someone noted above that saying, college education today for all is unrealistic. So that echoes what we're talking about even here in the 21st century. And certainly that knowledge should be relevant and related to real life is an idea rattling around very much today. He thought that whites would feel threatened if they lost their domestic and farm labor. Yeah, very good point.
Yeah,
okay.
I'd like to call your attention to, so there's a lot of comments here about education should be relevant and related to real life. But can we go back here for a moment? So when Booker T. Washington, we look at this last quote in red, You could locate the desert or the Sahara, so on and so forth, but you couldn't figure out where the knives and forks go and where the bread and meat should be. Well, what is Booker T. Washington talking about there?
Yeah, I think Laura Wakefield noted that. It sounds to me, she writes, like he wants to prepare them to serve as domestics.
You know, I think that's absolutely right. So he's not. I had a student ask me last week when I was talking about this. She was wondering, is Booker T. Washington saying that the proper place for women is in their home and not working? And I had to respond to her. I said, no, Booker T. Washington said the proper place for black women is not in their home, but is in the home of their employer. So when we talk about real life, well, what is real life? I mean, what real life does Booker T. Washington imagine for African Americans? I think that's an important question to pose.
Yeah, I think that really does make more complex this whole business of manual training and liberal arts education. I mean, manual training is one thing, but when manual training really closes down one's horizons and limits you to such things as being a domestic, then I think you may want to take some issue with it, perhaps. We have some more comments. We have to remember that Reconstruction was going on. Many people were needed to help in this area. Washington is thinking very practically. Laura writes, they don't know how to place knives and forks because they don't have knives and forks of their own, or they didn't have knives and forks of their own slavery. He's not setting the bar very high, Jack Carter writes. And another person notes, this is after Reconstruction, it's Laura again. The Freedmen's Bureau seems like a lost opportunity that might have made a difference, that might have made differences here moot. Had it gone forward, would the harsh racial attitudes been dulled, or were conditions in the South such that newly freed slaves had a long haul for acceptance? We might want to come back to that. My daughter commented that when she was in college, they wanted to take her to take college trig, and she wanted to know why she needed that. She took a class that was a basic math because the trig was not needed for her specialty. The basic math taught her how to balance a checkbook and the purpose of numbering on the checks and the Social Security card. She loved it. Now, this was a student that took honors AP courses in high school. So again, that mixture of the practical and the more high-minded. It's a great point. Our students, this is a point about relevancy and education. That's a great point. What is in our students' mind? What is in their perception of real life? Yes, so it all goes back to what you think is relevant. Let's see, some more comments. Of course, if they're to aspire to be the lady of the manor, they would need to know if the domestic was performing correctly, what inputs they encounter to get the perceptions of real life. I think this statement is still true and needs to be emphasized today among all races. I guess the notion of practicality. So we've got a mixed bag of responses there on that. Very interesting, and that reflects, as you know, as I said earlier, these issues are still rattling around here in the 21st century.
Right. I think to go back to the 19th century, just for a moment, there's a wonderful story, I think, about Booker T. Washington. He was asked by this relates to the purpose of education, and he was asked by a planter, a large landowner around Tuskegee, why it is that he should send his domestic servant to the Tuskegee Institute to learn how to cook when she could spit in the pan and see if it was hot. And then Booker T. Washington responded, and he said, well, the purpose of industrial education is to teach her not to spit in the pan. And I thought that was very telling. So I think the use, we would talk a little bit ago about how whites reacted to Booker T. Washington. Southern whites would have liked it because it was teaching a type of education, or it was teaching people to teach a type of education that would make African Americans more efficient in their place, as opposed to changing their place. And I think it goes back to the issue of with Booker T. Washington, learning how to set the table. Well, that is practical, certainly, because you need to know how to do that if you're going to work for somebody. But is that the reality that you want to teach students? Should you teach students to be accustomed to it, or should you teach them to think about it and challenge it, aspire for something else, and not necessarily just a college education? But I think those are the issues that are rattling around today, and certainly were at the forefront then.
Right, on that very point, we have a very interesting comment here. If I read that in just a quote, the one about the domestic, placing the meat in the silverware, without the context, I would say that he is stating one must know one's world as much as one should explore the other world. However, I am sure he also wanted to focus on being stationed in building up a life that was there for them at the given time. Again, that issue of the period, the Reconstruction era, making them educated and employable in their own world. The quote I do like: "No race can prosper till it learns that there is as much dignity in tilling a field as in writing poem," which is why I think it could mean something more if just reading the above statement. Ultimately, your hard work is valued. You are valued regardless. Like the old Jimmy Buffett song, "It's my job, they must not run on." So that's taking the quote about the domestic work and placing it in a larger context, I think. An interesting way to do that. I think the writer here is correct in that business of the quote, posing the quote about no race can prosper against the domestic quote. That really does make it more complex.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting, and that is I will say that is an interpretation that I hadn't really considered much. I'm going to have to rethink that some more.
Okay, shall we move on then?
Yes. So here is Du Bois's rejoinder to Washington. Since the war, and that would be the Civil War, has been industrial training for black boys. Nevertheless, I insist that the object of all true education is not to make men carpenters, it is to make carpenters men. There are two means of making the carpenter a man, each equally important. The from which he works liberally trained teachers and leaders to teach him and his family what life means. The second is to give him sufficient intelligence and technical skill to make him an efficient workman.
Okay,
so
go ahead.
No, so my questions to you is, well, how does that differ from Washington's approach?
Okay, how does that differ from Washington's approach? I think Du Bois' definition and the idea of a college is not as colleges today that we're thinking of, perhaps. I think this quote from the talented 10th, that often perhaps does not get included in the way these two men are taught. This really does make Du Bois' position more complex. Mm-hmm. It always seems that Du Bois is taught as purely, an advocate of a liberal arts education, completely ignoring any kind of practical skills. But here we see that's not what he was saying at all.
Right, and I think that from Du Bois's standpoint, that the issue of making carpenters men is not something that is limited to people who go to college. Mm-hmm. That men are not just college educated men, or humans are not just college educated. Does this work have to be taught earlier on?
Right. Right. So here he is responding to the criticism, or here he is raising a criticism of Washington, in which you might say that Washington is really lowering the horizons of people. He is saying, yes, provide practical training, but keep that horizon high. Talk about the meaning of life, as well as making a living.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think so, and I think we'll see that further as we go on here. Well, no, we'll be circling. I think several of these points are intertwined, and we will be getting back to them. Mm-hmm. Shall we move on?
Yes, let's do that. We've got about 45 minutes.
Okay, great. So their third area of disagreement, I think, was on capitalism. Washington embraced the capitalism that was ascendant after the Civil War. He wanted to grab onto the Gilded Age and ride it to the end. And as we had mentioned before, he intuited that Frederick Douglass's moral critiques would not have traction when people were primarily interested in making money. Du Bois, on the other hand, I think he had a complicated view of the Gilded Age, but I think it's fair to say that he was suspicious of Gilded Age capitalism and what it was doing to African Americans. So let's take a look at some of these divergent points of view. Would you like to read this?
Sure. This is a very famous part of the speech. Cast it down. He's talking about a bucket here. Cast it down in agriculture, mechanics, in commerce, in domestic service, and in the professions. And in this connection, it is well to bear in mind that whatever other sins the South may be called to bear, when it comes to business pure and simple, it is in the South that the Negro is given a man's chance in the commercial world. And in nothing is this exposition more eloquent than in emphasizing this chance. To those of the white race who look to the incoming of those of foreign birth and strange tongue and habits of the prosperity of the South, were I permitted, I would repeat what I say to my own race. Cast down your bucket where you are. Cast down your bucket among these people who have, without strikes and labor wars, tilled your fields, cleared your forests, builded your railroads and cities, and brought forth treasures from the bowels of the earth, and helped make possible this magnificent representation of the progress of the South. Casting down your bucket among my people, helping and encouraging them as you are doing on these grounds, and to make education of the head, hand, and heart, you will find that they will buy your surplus land, make blossom the waste places in your fields, and run your factories. Whoa, he could talk.
He certainly could.
So what about our discussion questions here, Kenneth?
Yeah, yes. You know, somebody had mentioned earlier the metaphor of the fingers and hands, and we'll get to that. But cast down your buckets is one of the enduring metaphors of the Atlantic Compromise. And I used to think it meant one thing, and as I studied it more, I think there are many meanings of this metaphor. So what is he talking about here? What sort of what should blacks cast down for, and what should whites cast down for?
Okay. Good questions. What are we casting down our buckets for? A really homey but effective image. We all can see ourselves casting down our buckets into a well or a river or whatever. So, okay, the American dream. There you go. That's a pretty good summary of it all here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I particularly like that last paragraph there. I mean, he is talking, I mean, again, as Kenneth suggested, we should put what we know, we should put all this material in the broader context of what we know. And of course, at this time, you were having great immigration into the United States from Europe. So whites need to work with the newly freed states who are not prone to strikes and labor disturbances, right? Black and whites in the South knew each other pretty well.
And you know, it was a place where blacks were blacks and whites were whites. You know, what I mean by that is that you know, I had a student ask me the other day. He said, "Well, how did whites react to Booker T. Washington's speech?" And I had to say, well, you know, in the North you had whites, you know, native-born whites, but you also had Italians and Poles and Jews and Russians and others who had not been assimilated into American whiteness, if you will. And there were a lot of, you know, what we know about the Gilded Age, and you know, there was immigration was a hot button issue like it is today. There were strikes. There were all sorts of theories being spun out on either reforming the capitalist system or overthrowing it. There were scares about anarchists, and Washington is offering a lifeline to these people, South and North. He's offering a lifeline. He said, well, if you employ us, if you don't, you know, if you shun those people of foreign birth with strange tongues and with, you know, whose last names end in a vowel or something like that, then if you do that, you can avoid all the destabilizing that will occur when they start working for you, because black people will be loyal. They will do the job. We will put our heads down. We won't get involved in politics. He's really offering kind of something that looks utopian from the Southern whites' point of view, but also from the Northern whites' point of view.
That's right, and the Northern whites, particularly the immigrant whites, because he is not saying leave the South. He is not saying go north and challenge these immigrants. He's saying stay here, cast your bucket down where you are, here. Yeah, I can see that's a pretty canny argument to be making when he made it.
And, you know, in the 1880s and 1890s, there were plans in Wilmington, North Carolina, and I'm sure in elsewhere to import Italian laborers and import other European immigrant laborers to do the work. And Booker T. Washington is saying not. And it's also, I will say, going back to the issue of education and what type of education was appropriate, you know, the northern white opinion, and in particular northern philanthropic opinion, was that African Americans should get an education that would suit them for their station in life, so that the economy could be stable, we could get rid of all the social issues that were agitating whites and blacks. And so this offered something to the, you know, the philanthropic opinion as well, you know, that it promised stability for the economy.
Okay, shall we move on then?
Sure. So here we go. Booker T. Du Bois had a, as we've seen, had a different point of view here. This is from The Souls of Black Folk. Mr. Washington came with a simple, definite program at the psychological moment when the nation was a little ashamed of having bestowed so much sentiment on Negroes and was concentrating its energies on dollars. By singular insight, he intuitively grasped the spirit of the age which was dominating the North, and so thoroughly did he learn the speech and thought of triumphant commercialism, the ideals of material prosperity, and the picture of a lone black boy poring over a French grammar amid the weeds and dirt of a neglected home soon seemed to him the acme of absurdities. One wonders what Socrates and St. Francis of Assisi would say to this. This is an age of unusual economic development, and Mr. Washington's program naturally takes an economic cast, becoming a gospel of work and money to such an extent as apparently almost completely to overshadow the higher aims of life. And I would like to add, before we get on to this discussion of Du Bois's point of view, I would like to add this last piece on. This is a retrospective comment about industrial education and the problems with it. And what comes before this is his statement, is Du Bois's statement that nobody knew in the late 19th century the energy that would be unleashed by capitalism and the new types of jobs and the new types of industries, and that if industrial education was behind the curve, if it wasn't teaching manual skills that people would need to participate in the economy, that was unexpected. But he goes on and he says there was another problem with industrial education, and this is the point that I would like to read to consider with the other quotes. In one respect, however, the Negro industrial school was seriously at fault. It set its face toward the employer and the capitalist and the man of wealth. It looked upon the worker as one to be adapted to the demands of those who conducted industry. Both in its general program and in its classroom, it neglected almost entirely the modern labor movement. The very vehicle which was to train Negroes for modern industry neglected in its teaching the most important part of modern industrial development, namely the relation of worker to modern industry and to the modern state. So I think this gives a different dimension to Du Bois's comment about things that you're supposed to learn in school. It's, you know, you should learn about issues of life, you should learn a foreign language, you should learn about Greek mythology, things, a liberal arts education, which would help round you out. But also you need to learn about the relations between workers and employers, what your rights are, things like that he believed industrial education did not teach.
Yeah, I think along these lines, one of our participants now has introduced a word here into the conversation I think is very important. She writes, I think he felt that if whites in the South did not feel threatened, this practice would cease to exist, and that is the discrimination that was going on against African Americans at the time. I think the key word there is threatened. Booker T. Washington's position didn't threaten anybody, really, whereas Du Bois, when you begin to talk about the labor movement, it's a threat. Yeah.
So, I mean, we've talked around it, but perhaps people would like to comment about the spirit of the age, and and the types of subjects that Du Bois would teach and that Washington would teach.
Mhm. Yeah. Again, putting this in the context of what we already know about this period in history. Du Bois is a promoter of the labor movement. What is he advocating that should be taught in school? Perhaps some labor history here. It is almost like one argument was that they wanted blacks to make an immediate impact in the workforce. The other side is that if blacks are to go to college, their impact will be felt much later. Yeah, I think that's probably true. Wouldn't it be fair to say, Kenneth, that Du Bois's view is kind of a longer horizon in terms of time?
Could be. Yes. Yes. I think that as I think about how I teach this, and maybe how you all teach it, when people say something like Du Bois was in favor of people going to college, I think it's important to ask, well, what does that mean? I mean, what do you learn in college, or what would you learn in K through 12? What does Du Bois want you to learn? Sometimes to say go to college, it means different things to different people, and then it ultimately, you don't get to the meaning. You just say, well, get a college degree. And so I think it's important to flesh that out. The types of things Du Bois is saying people should learn.
Mm-hmm. It's a good question. Say people followed what Du Bois said. Would the college grad be employed in the North? So was there, if African Americans did go to college, was there much of a market for their skills once they got out of school?
No. I mean, well, yes and no. They could teach. There were some African American attorneys, not many, and although that number would grow, there were, as I'm thinking about it here, there were, in the 1920s, there was a rapid growth of teachers,
Mm-hmm.
educators, but in many industries there was still the color bar. So you're not talking about a lot of employment opportunities, but you're not also talking about a lot of African Americans who are going to college. I think I would kind of tilt the discussion away from the issue of college education. I think Du Bois probably envisioned that people who would go to college would teach or would assume positions in a segregated economy, bankers, attorneys, things like that, doctors. But I think the key thing here is what is going to be the heart of the education that you're going to teach. What lessons do you want to impart to the African American masses, as opposed to do you go to a trade school or do you go to a 4-year liberal arts college?
Mm-hmm. Right, and Diana, let me just pick up that point about there not being terribly many African Americans who would go on because of the cost of a college education, and then perhaps a great many did not want to go on. Very quickly here, we have a question about unions in the South. Mm-hmm. Is the failure of unions in the South because of the failure to unionize blacks and educate blacks about strength in numbers? Very quickly on that one, Kenneth. Then we move on.
Yeah, I think that is part of the problem. Organized labor throughout the country was at this time until at least the 1930s was not interested in organizing African Americans, with the exception of Knights of Labor. So yes, that would impact adversely the vitality of labor unions.
Mm-hmm. And how about people who graduated from Tuskegee? Were they employed?
I think they were. Yes, they were, and they were mainly. Tuskegee trained teachers. They didn't train carpenters. I mean, so they got the industrial education, but their main purpose when they left was to go and teach in local school systems. So they would teach to other people the things that they learned.
Oh, I see. Okay, good. Well, shall we move on then?
Yes. This issue of political rights, we've talked a bit about this. In its starkest terms, in his Atlanta Compromise, Booker T. Washington advocated and accepted segregation. But they didn't share the same and Du Bois kind of cautiously agreed with that in its beginning. But whereas the Washington's trajectory was in giving up political rights, Du Bois was not willing to do that. So let's take a look at what each person said again. Here again is from the Atlanta Compromise speech. We shall stand by you with a devotion that no foreigner can approach. Let me just inject here, the use of foreigner here, and is comparing and contrasting African Americans to immigrants. We shall stand by you with a devotion that no foreigner can approach, ready to lay down our lives if need be in defense of yours, interlacing our industrial, commercial, civil, and religious life with yours in a way that shall make the interests of both races one. In all things that are purely social, we can be as separate as the fingers, yet one is the hand in all things essential to mutual progress. The wisest among my race understand that the agitation of questions of social equality is the extremist folly, and that progress in the enjoyment of all the privileges that will come to us must be the result of severe and constant struggle, rather than of artificial forcing. No race that has anything to contribute to the markets of the world is long in any degree ostracized. It is important and right that all privileges of the law be ours, but it is vastly more important that we be prepared for the exercises of these privileges. The opportunity to earn $1 in a factory just now is worth infinitely more than the opportunity to spend $1 in an opera house.
Okay, very famous passage from the speech. So what about our discussion questions?
This is the second enduring metaphor. All things purely social, we can be as separate as the fingers, yet one is the hands, and all things essential to mutual progress. What is Washington talking about here? And if you followed this, if you accept this, where do you end up? What's the logical conclusion if you follow the statement?
What is logical conclusion? It's a brilliant metaphor. I mean, if he's talking about work and manual labor, I mean, you can't have a better metaphor than the hand. And the way he has structured it here, everybody can see it. It's like cast down your buckets. The man really was a master of language. And Laura Wakefield writes, what we're heading for is separate but equal. Socially, he is saying that they do not want to mix the races. They will stay separate. Again, separate and presumably equal. So is that fair to say, Kenneth? We're heading for separate but equal?
Oh, I think so. I think that's exactly where we're heading, although, as we know, the separate part is very clear. The equal part is less clear, and is frequently, not the case.
I think the question, the second discussion question there, should rights under the law be contingent upon one or another's concept of development? I think that is really a key question. And why don't we pose that to our participants? What do you think about that?
Yeah.
Should rights under the law be contingent upon one or another concept of development, which is, of course, what Washington is suggesting here? Any takers on that question? Seems to me that would be a really good one to pose to your students. A very thought-provoking question. How can African Americans pledge more political involvement? Okay, repeat again, please, the question. Okay, should rights under law be contingent upon one or another concept of development? In other words, should you have your rights under the law, or should they depend on some prior agreements? We'll develop in a certain way.
Right. That you have rights. If you have X amount of rights in one area, if you can show that you own enough property, or if you can show to somebody's satisfaction that you are moral. Booker T. Washington here seems to be saying, well, we should have the right to go eat where we want, but let's wait. Let's hold off on pushing for that until we earn enough money.
Right. Okay.
Which is what you're talking about there.
Okay. No, we give rights to all men. We are people to vote who are not necessarily we allow people to vote who are not necessarily educated on the issues. Let's see. Do we know if he wanted to be separate, or if this was simply a method of solving the problem? In other words, did he think this was good, or just a means to an end of eventual better terms? That's a pretty good idea. I mean, this is based on behind this is a notion of racial inferiority. Is that fair to say, Kenneth?
Yes. Yes. Behind this is the notion that certainly the whites' notion that African Americans are inferior. As we'll see in a few slides later, I don't think Booker T. Washington held that point of view. But he certainly understood that whites did, and so he was going to accommodate to that.
So this is a strategy for Booker T.
Yes.
Washington. Okay, that's a very
Yes.
important point, I think. So a question there. Okay.
Yeah, that is. And here is Washington's Du Bois's rejoinder. The group of men honor Mr. Washington for his attitude of conciliation toward the white South. They accept the Atlanta Compromise in its broadest interpretation. They recognize with him many signs of promise, many men of high purpose and fair judgment in this section. They know that no easy task has been laid upon a region already tottering under heavy burdens. And then he goes on to, once he has said that people accept it in its broadest configuration, he then goes on and says, well, we really don't agree with it. Mr. Washington distinctly asked that black people give up, at least for the present, three things. First, political power. Second, insistence on civil rights. Third, higher education of Negro youth, and concentrate all their energies on industrial education and accumulation of wealth and the conciliation of the South. This policy has been courageously and insistently advocated for over 15 years and has been triumphant for perhaps 10 years. As a result of this tender of the palm branch, what has been the return? In these years, there have occurred the disfranchisement of the Negro, the legal creation of a distinct status of civil inferiority for the Negro. These movements are not, to be sure, direct results of Mr. Washington's teachings, but his propaganda has, without a shadow of a doubt, helped their speedier accomplishment. The question then comes, is it possible and probable that 9 millions of men can make effective progress in economic lines if they are deprived of political rights, have made a servile caste, and allowed only the most meager chance of developing their exceptional men? If history and reason give any distinct answer to these questions, it is an emphatic no.
It might be important to point here, when did W.E.B. Du Bois write this essay in response to Washington? How many years had elapsed between the Atlanta Compromise speech and Du Bois's response? 6 years. So we're beginning to see the coalescence of Jim Crow by this time.
That's correct. That's correct.
Okay, so
and I think the issue of the broadest compromise that Du Bois was referring to were things like, I think Du Bois would have been, it would have been acceptable to him, for example, to put restrictions on voting, that you couldn't vote unless you had so much property, or you paid a poll tax, or you could pass a literacy or education test. Du Bois would have been fine with that if that would have been applied equally to whites and blacks.
Ah, okay.
So he's not terribly democratic in that regard.
Okay. We have a question here. We're going to have to respond quickly and then be moving ahead. Did Washington respond back to Du Bois's criticisms?
Oh, we'll get to that in a little bit, but the answer is no.
Oh.
Washington preferred to show himself above the fray. His position depended on his being recognized as the black leader, and if there was any opposition to him, he had to treat it as non-existent or trivial or sour grapes.
Okay. All right. Well, we've got a little over 20 minutes, so shall we move on then?
Yes, let's. So this is how does, so it's a question about strategy. Did Washington believe that African Americans were inferior or not? And here is Washington talking about it. I do not believe that the Negro should cease voting, for a man cannot learn the exercise of self-government by ceasing to vote, any more than a boy can learn to swim by keeping out of the water. But I do believe that in his voting, he should more and more be influenced by those of intelligence and character who are his next-door neighbors. As a rule, I believe in universal free suffrage, but I believe that in the South we are confronted with peculiar conditions that justify the protection of the ballot in many of the states, for a while at least, either by an education test, a property test, or by both combined. But whatever tests are required, they should be made to apply with equal and exact justice to both races.
Okay. So our discussion question here, what qualifications or modifications did Washington place on the Atlanta Compromise in these passages? Do you think it substantially changes the thrust of the compromise? Is Washington moderating his views here? Seems to me he's opening a door for some political power given to African Americans. What do our participants think? Does this compromise the Atlanta Compromise in any way? Okay. Limited political involvement. He wants everyone to be an educated voter. Yeah, I think.
Or he wants everybody who's voting to be educated.
Yeah. Yeah, well, there you go. That's a good way to put it. So let's see. This seems as pragmatic as the Jim Crow laws force no compromise instead of an answer. Okay, does this open up a chink in the position that he's putting forth in the Atlanta Compromise, Kenneth?
I think it does. There is a moderate opening there, but I don't think that the people that he was compromising with heard it. So I think that they heard the Atlanta Compromise and they ran with it. And I think whatever modifications Washington wanted to make, he was not able to. He was not able to affect that.
So his audience really did do nuance, right?
Yes, that's right. And so you see it here because Booker T. Washington somewhat later says, he says, people think that I mean by segregation, I mean by separate as the fingers, they mean separate cars and separate seating rooms and railroad stations. And he says, that's not my position. But by then it doesn't matter.
Okay. So this by then it doesn't matter. We have here an interesting point of view from Laura Wakefield. It seems to me like Booker T supports the idea that only some blacks should vote, kind of class system within black society, the talented 10th. So does he in some ways agree with Du Bois about the question of the talented 10th here?
Oh, I think that I would say their agreement was on the nature of democracy. Rather than saying that Washington believed in a talented 10th, I think that kind of mixes it up too much. But I do think that either both men were comfortable with the idea of restrictions on voting, and I think probably both men were uncomfortable with the idea of, say, Jacksonian democracy, opening up political participation to the majority. I think they were suspicious of the majority.
Okay. All right. Well, shall we move on then?
Yes. Okay. Let's. And here, Washington. Who am I talking about here? Du Bois. Sorry. Here is Du Bois saying about Booker T. Washington that he may have raised his voice in protest mildly at some points, but despite that, what is really more true and what has more weight is that Washington's speech opened the door for the disfranchisement, and any modifications he may have made afterward did not have the weight or the effect that the initial compromise had.
So when he went back, he couldn't shade it in. I mean, it was, as you said earlier, the people heard that compromise, his audience, the white audience, heard that compromise and really ran with it, and that's what they held him to.
Yes, and I will just go back for a moment here. This comment here about what counted as a social interaction, this came just a month after the compromise. So already people were understanding the compromise. Whites were understanding that compromise in a way that was very advantageous to them. And Washington, once it was out of his mouth, he couldn't, even if he wanted to, he couldn't pull it back and modify it. Okay, good. Well, shall we move on then? Yes. disagreements with whites. This has a lot to do with what is your posture going to be toward toward whites. How are you going to relate to them? And not surprisingly, they disagreed a lot here. Booker T. Washington, as you can see from this slide, these are all instances of his saying things about black people that would confirm for whites their inferior nature. Okay, and I think the one I would just point out here is the first one. 30 years ago, starting 30 years ago, with ownership here and there, and quite in a few quilts and pumpkins and chickens gathered from miscellaneous sources, he is reinforcing the idea that African Americans are, are thieves, chicken thieves, raiding the hen house, and these other ones are along the same lines of things that we have seen before about the folly of studying Greek, or people getting too big for their britches, or acting in comical ways. He was quite deliberate in posing these representations of African Americans, I think, because he believed that it made African Americans less threatening to the whites that he needed to influence and get to work with him.
Okay, so he is using stereotypical language here that would connect with the stereotypes whites already had in their minds.
Right, that's correct. That's correct.
Okay.
And so here I will, if you look at this statement from Du Bois really confirms what Washington was doing there. He says, "Oh, Washington was a politician. He was a man who believed that we should get what we could get. It wasn't a matter of ideals or anything of that sort. He had no faith in white people, not the slightest, and he was most popular among them, because if he was talking with a white man, he sat there and found out what the white man wanted him to say, and then as soon as possible, he said it."
I think it's important to note the date on that. That's 1960, so he's had quite a few years now to reflect back on who Booker T. Washington really was.
That's correct. That's correct. And so it came up earlier in the webinar. Somebody asked about did Washington believe the things he was saying? I think you have to answer no. That he did not accept black inferiority. Certainly not in that it was inherent or essential to African Americans. But he used it to try and get what he wanted.
Mm-hmm. Do you think this is a position that Du Bois would have uttered, say, in 1910? I mean, how much of this kind of really realistic and almost cynical view is a result of 50 years of reflection, do you think, Kenneth?
Oh, that's a good question. I think he recognized it back then, but I think things were very heated between the two of them, and he probably didn't have the luxury of saying that.
Yeah.
But I think he recognized that Washington was a politician and wanted to would do anything to advance his position.
Yeah. Sounds as if maybe there's a little bit of forgiveness here. Is that fair to say?
Yes, I think so.
All right. Well, shall we move on then? Oh, here we go. Here are the discussion questions you could pose around those. I think this would make a really excellent exercise for students because it gets you to focus on the language and the metaphors that Washington used. Here we have a comment. There are always two ways to rise to the top. He was clandestine and very effective for gaining what he wanted, yet you also need the other side of pointing along the way the injustice of acquiescence. It's a very good point. And there's a question came up earlier that I was going to hold to the end, but this question really leads into it quite nicely. A participant asked, even though Washington and Du Bois disagreed, wasn't it good that their disagreement provoked discussion on some sort of compromise, on the place of African Americans in American society at the time? Did their disagreement actually do that? I mean, were white folks debating whether or not Washington or Du Bois was correct, or was this debate pretty much restricted to the African American community?
Yes, I think this debate was pretty much restricted to African Americans, and this gets to this issue here, our next big topic. Washington's position as the black leader in the United States was dependent. Washington got that position. He was appointed that by white philanthropy, and that's basically it. He was able to get to the White House and have dinner with Theodore Roosevelt. He was able to appoint people to patronage positions because of his influence with the Carnegies and the Baldwins and the Rockefellers and the Rosenwalds and others, the Peabodys, the great industrialists of the United States, of the Gilded Age. He was able. His influence allowed him to be the leader, and his position as the leader, I think, was dependent on his presenting himself as the unrivaled leader. And so the white opinion really didn't care about the nuance and the debate. They just wanted to know what black people thought. And Washington was able to suppress that debate among whites. And that's how he survived for so long as the undisputed leader. There was a very vital debate and rigorous debate within black communities. So I think that white communities really didn't see what was going on until much later.
So once again, coming back to your point, the white audiences heard the compromise and they stopped listening at that point. That's what they grabbed.
Yes, they heard what they wanted to hear. That's
right.
Correct. And you see here Washington in this here as he's talking about his reaction to the Atlantic Compromise. He says there was some problems, there was some criticism of me, but over time everybody was won over to my way, which was not the case.
Right. But the Tuskegee machine made it appear that it was the case.
That's correct. And he was able to use both the carrot and the stick to try and keep people in line. The carrot would be appointments to patronage positions, a collector of customs, things like that. The stick would be getting people fired. Du Bois at one point asked Washington for a letter of recommendation to become an official in the Washington, D.C. School board, the black school board. Washington said yes, he would be glad to write the letter, and then wrote a letter trashing him. And Du Bois didn't get the job.
So their paths crossed in more ways than one. I didn't realize that.
Yes.
Here we have a question: are there any parallels with other immigrants fighting for suffrage and emerging rights, such as Latinos or Asians? Maybe we could come to that later on if we have some time, because we are reaching the end of our discussion here, and we need to move ahead. So why don't we move on to the next one? Next slide.
Okay. Well, these are all. What we have here. This slide and this slide are all dealing with Washington's trying to suppress criticism, and Du Bois's insisting that that criticism be allowed and that debate be allowed. And in this particular slide here, Du Bois is leveling a criticism to Washington that his position is being influenced, Washington's position is being buttressed and influenced by people outside, and who are pushing a particular point of view on black people, and that gets to the philanthropic backing of Washington over Du Bois, and so for go on.
No, I was just agreeing.
Yeah. So if we can. I think this is fairly explanatory. So if we're running short on time, I would just call your attention to this. This is Du Bois's recollection of when he met Washington and Andrew Carnegie, and it gets to how Du Bois related to Carnegie. I think we can save that. It just kind of buttresses some of the things we've been talking about. But I would say use that in your class. It's a great representation of the attitudes of Du Bois and Washington toward people in power. I think it draws out the differences wonderfully.
So it goes back to the notion of Washington then as a consummate politician.
Absolutely. Yeah, as a very good politician, and Du Bois as being a reluctant politician and not as effective in the close infighting and elbowing. But But at the same time, Du Bois was insistent on his dignity, and Washington, I think, was not insistent in the same way.
Mm-hmm. We have a good comment here. It appears that Booker expressed what whites what they wanted to hear, and Du Bois expressed what blacks wanted to hear during this time. I think the first part of that is correct. We've already talked about that. But was Du Bois saying things that black audiences wanted to hear? Was he tailoring his message for black consumption?
Yes, but I think he was. I think more importantly, he was not trimming what he said to suit whites. I think Du Bois. I think I think Du Bois was happy telling the truth as he saw it, and I think Washington was more comfortable trimming what he said so that he would get a good hearing from whites.
Okay, again,
so, and I think Du Bois was very interested in talking to African Americans as as an audience.
Okay. Shall we move on then?
Yes. And here we are. This is our our conclusion actually here. These are the 6 areas that we have talked about. They disagreed on emancipation and reconstruction, on education, on capitalism, on political rights, on relations with whites, and on political leadership.
Okay, so this is our sort of review slide, which allows me to bring in a question here that was asked earlier on, very early in the conversation, and I thought it was such a good question, and I knew this slide was coming up, so I thought I'd bring it in here. We talked about teaching Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois as kind of polarities, and we talked about we were going to expand out those polarities to encompass disagreements other than manual education and liberal arts. So one of our participants asked early on, does it make sense to teach them in terms of disagreements and polarities at all? Is there another way to teach them that you could avoid this kind of, he said kind of discussion? So how would you respond to that, Kenneth?
Well, that's a really good question. That's my main response. I think it does make sense to teach it as a polarity, in the sense that in 1900, at the late 19th century and into the 20th century, that these two people were debating fiercely. And it's more fair to say that Du Bois was fiercely attacking Washington. I think that they had distinct points of view. So I think in that way, it makes sense to teach it like that. What I think you lose by teaching it like Du Bois versus Washington is that there were other registers of opinion. There were people who agreed with both, or people who it doesn't include, for example, the debate over female education and what type of education was appropriate for black women. So you miss some things. But I think in terms of what education and emancipation would look like in the 20th century, at the dawn of the 20th century, it makes sense to teach it like that.
Mm-hmm. And they defined themselves to some extent by their disagreements.
Yes, that's correct.
So it does make sense to do that. And there are a number of other questions that came up that we didn't, I wanted to save toward the end here. A number of questions came up about the Tuskegee Institute as a model for African American higher education. Did that model, was that model followed by many other black institutions of higher education?
Well, there was the Hampton Institute, and there's Tuskegee, and there were some other ones. Washington, because of his influence, tended to punish, I would say, liberal arts colleges, and they were cut off from a lot of funding from the major northern philanthropists.
Mm-hmm.
They were able to survive, and there was some contention. So at Fisk University, even as late as the mid-1920s, philanthropists said that they would not continue to fund Fisk unless they added a manual training department. So I think Tuskegee was a model, and I think probably some of the land grant, the black land grant colleges followed that model.
Mm-hmm.
But but I don't, it was not the dominant model. It was not the only model, I should say.
I see. And then we have the question about the Latinos and Asians, a question we deferred to the end here. Do you see any parallels between the Latino and Asian struggle to enter mainstream American society today with that parallels what we've seen here in our seminar today with African Americans?
I would like to know what the participants think about that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let's throw that open. Do you see any parallels between the struggles of folks coming to this country afresh here in the 21st century and trying to find their place in the mainstream with the struggles that African Americans were making at this time late in the 19th and early 20th century? Any takers on that one? Our participants, in their classrooms, they see this played out every day. I think it depends on where the people come from. Very, very discriminating point of view. Good. Depends. It's difficult because today the opposite is true. The type thing is quite stifled in discussion. However, I do see some similar items, different tactics. I'm an immigrant myself, and yes, it is a struggle. Okay, so I don't think the parallels are maybe immediately forthcoming. I think life itself is a struggle, and we all have to make our own way. So as I say, I don't think the parallels are immediately forthcoming, but I didn't want to ignore that question because I know the diversity of this country is very much on the minds of teachers who see it every day in their classrooms. We wanted to end by sharing with you this poem. If you're not familiar with it, you may want to make yourselves familiar with it. It's Booker T and W.E.B. by Dudley Randall. Shall we end this by reading this poem, Kenneth?
Sure. I'd be glad to read it.
Okay. Why don't you put it out there?
It seems to me, said Booker T, it shows a mighty lot of cheek to study chemistry and Greek when Mr. Charlie needs a hand to hoe the cotton on his land, and when Miss Ann looks for a cook, why stick your nose inside a book? I don't agree, said W.E.B. If I should have the drive to seek knowledge of chemistry or Greek, I'll do it. Charles and Miss can look another place for a hand or cook. Some men rejoice in skill of hand, and some in cultivating land. But there are others who maintain the right to cultivate the brain. It seems to me, said Booker T, that all you folks have missed the boat, who shout about the right to vote, and spend vain days and sleepless nights in uproar over civil rights. Just keep your mouth shut, do not grouse, but work and save and buy a house. I don't agree, said W.E.B. For what can property fail if dignity and justice fail? Unless you help to make the laws, they'll steal your house with trumped-up claws. A rope's as tight, a fire is hot, no matter how much cash you've got. Speak soft and try your little plan, but as for me, I'll be a man. It seems to me, said Booker T. I don't agree, said W.E.B.
Well, maybe we should have started with that poem because it sets the polarity out very, very cleverly and with finer language than you and I can summon, and we could have unpacked that and gone from there to the rest of our seminar if we tried to open up the polarity here stated by Dudley Rand. Well, ladies and gentlemen, let me ask you: have you any questions? Anything we have left unanswered here before we wrap things up this morning? Okay. Very nice. Does set the tone, but I think W is talking about our poem. W.B. does not want to be held back by anyone. Anyway, great talk. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, please use the forum to continue the discussion and to share fresh approaches and questions at work. We'll monitor the forum until March 13th. That means we'll be passing any of your comments and questions on to Kenneth, and we'll get back to you on them. Our next Florida Virtual School National Humanities Center seminar is on March 13th. It will be called Over There, Why America Entered World War I, be led by Dirk Bonker from Duke University. So, ladies and gentlemen, let me remind you, please submit your evaluations. You'll find them on the Rethinking Booker T and W.E.B. website. Those are very important to us. We look forward to getting those, and we pay attention to them and try to improve our seminars based on what you tell us. Kenneth, I want to thank you very much for giving us an excellent seminar this morning. I really appreciate it. I learned a great deal.
Thank you very much, and I appreciate the questions, and I will answer whatever further questions come in. So
okay.
Thank you for inviting me.
And ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you for your intelligent and enthusiastic participation this morning. Look forward to meeting with all of you again next month on March 13th. And so for this morning, thank you very much. You can escape your online classroom by going up to File in the upper left-hand corner of your screen. Clicking there, you'll see a drop-down menu. I think the last item is Leave Session. Click on that and you're home free. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, and have a good day. Bye-bye.